Music industry changes and conflict. Manousso musing with business guru Hank Moore. Part of the series, Titans of Mediations with seasoned mediator trainer Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso. This is our topic for today.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And I'm Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso in Houston, Texas, and Newport, Rhode Island. And I'm a practitioner as well as a trainer, and I'm an admirer of Hank Moore, who's based in Houston, Texas. And we're delighted today to have Hank tell us about the music industry. And it is a representation. He has been all over the media on his latest book on pop culture and pop music. So we're going to have that opportunity to talk to Hank Moore. And he has been a person who is a futurist. He's helped businesses all over the world in the Fortune 500 category. And the music industry, of course, is part of our big industry in America. Tell us about that, Hank. And thank you so much for being here today to share this information. Because as we all know, music is the fabric of our lives, and it's the soundtrack to what we remember over time. So your book is so important.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, this is my 14th book. This is the new one, Pop Music Legends. And on the cover of it, we styled it after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band cover. And that's why the Beatles are there with Beyonce standing in the middle of them. And the other people on the cover are some of the people that I've met in the music industry, notably Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, Bruce Springsteen, the Beatles, and Beyonce. And I got to introduce Beyonce in concert, in fact, a few years ago. Music is a part of everybody's life. It's also, the music industry is one of the top 10 businesses of the world. It is very big business. And it's not all just about memories, although music is the repurposing of music, the repackaging. A lot of people would be surprised to know that 42% of all the records and CDs and downloads sold every year are golden oldies repackaged. There's that much nostalgia that returns. And then once you get into the Christmas season, Christmas music is referred to as an annuity in the business. The songs keep on keeping on year after year, decade after decade. That's chapter 9 in this book. There is a Christmas music chapter. But music is to be shared, it's to be played, it's to be learned. One of the trends in music, and it's been going on for many years, is how creatively you repackage the music. Every time there's a change in technology, the old records get rechanneled and repackaged and resold to younger generations. Now that causes conflict because of people doing downloads without paying royalties, and you get into all kinds of issues. There's a lot of, and then during the time that the record industry a few years ago started picking on individuals for downloading music and not paying royalties, that ran into a number of issues that required all kinds of legal action and some mediation. In some cases, the artist just simply ceased and desisted. One of the current trends in music that's very big is hip hop, and hip hop is the narratives are what are new, and a lot of times they'll use older music, sometimes without paying the royalties, often without paying the royalties. That's where you run into music sometimes, where people lift other people's music and don't necessarily pay the royalties for it. Yeah.
Hank, I would like to take a moment. We're going to do this interview in two parts because you have so much to share,
Mhm.
and it's going to be so influential and interesting for the mediation and arbitration community. But you are a walking encyclopedia and not just something that has been read. You were there. You
Right.
were with so many icons of the pop world. Could you, and I everybody needs to get your book. These are the best Christmas items anybody could imagine, that they can give as gifts this year, and all your whole series. But I think this is going to be one that's extra special. But could you just tickle us a little bit with a couple stories and walk down memory lane of a couple of the salacious stories you might want to share with us right now?
A lot of them were interesting, fun ones. I grew up as a little kid. I remember I was 5 years old when we got a TV set, and one of the TV shows that I watched growing up was called Your Hit Parade, where they would restage as live music videos every Saturday night. This came on NBC in the 1950s, and they would restage. And that's one of where I learned my ideas that I took into business, was that the more you cover other people's songs, there's where the creativity is. It's not a sin to cover and pay royalties for other people's music. You want to share it to new generations with new artists doing the songs in different ways. But I started working in the music industry and around it in the long ago, far away. It was the year 1958, and I was 10 years old. And I started as a radio disc jockey at a radio station in a little bitty town called Austin, Texas. And and the population of Austin was 50,000 back then. It's 1.5 million now. But the first star that I ever met was the biggest star in the music industry. It was the one and only Elvis Presley. And I was sitting
Woo!
there working. Yeah, I mean, and I was doing, and I learned later that the owners of the radio station, who were Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, asked Elvis to come in and, as they said, do a favor for the kid. So they did. And LBJ
You're
used to
the
say,
kid.
yeah, he used to say, you always start at the top. So I started at the top, and I met the biggest star in America. Elvis was in his Army uniform when I met him. He had just been drafted into the Army. And in middle America, that was seen, drafting this rock star into the military was a way of suppressing rock and roll music. Well, it didn't work out that way, because the people got more and more interested in rock and roll, went from being a fringe type of music to mainstreaming.
Sure.
So the door to the studio flings open, and I see this Army soldier walking in, and I thought, what? He said, hi, I just thought I'd stop in and do an interview. And I thought, what is an Army soldier doing coming in here? And he sat down, and his badge said Private Elvis Presley. And I went, oh, because he was in the state at Fort Hood up in Killeen doing his basic training at the time, and he hung out in Austin. So I said, first question I ever asked him was, what do they feed you in the Army? What is something really terrible that you learned to love? That's what I learned early on, was you asked the off the wall questions. He said, I love burned bacon. And that's what they serve in the Army whether you like it or not. And one of his favorite things to eat for the rest of his life was burned bacon.
Hmm.
And so that's interesting. So then I asked him for my next question. I said, everyone is saying that the Army got you and they put you away for 2 years to suppress rock and roll. This kid's music is rock and roll. Do you think it's going to last? And he smiled and he said, well, the audience isn't always going to be kids. And that was
Oh,
profound. And so, one of the
wow.
things that I learned to watch out for over the years was how many changes happened in the music industry, how the customer base was listened to, and how trends came and went. And sometimes the older trends would come back as golden oldies. And that's why a lot of young people today love the old music. It's not that they knew it then, but they all still know who Elvis and the Beatles are. I run into young people every day, and they say, "Oh, you met Elvis." They know Elvis has been gone a very long time, but they know all that stuff. So what I learned as time went on was you to take there was a mediation opportunity early on in radio. There was a major scandal called the payola scandal, where people were paying disc jockeys under the table to get records featured on the radio based upon being paid payola, not because of the quality of the music. Those of us, because in those days, the good old days, disc jockeys could pick whatever they wanted to play. They weren't dictated to by consultants in other cities. You will play this. You will run a computer printout, and you will not deviate from the format. That's what it became in the 1980s. But in the late 1950s, you could play anything that you wanted, and your judgment of what you played and how you structured it was what got you ratings, and you got paid a lot of money and you got more advertising. So that's what the music industry taught me, is the more you listen to your customer base and you focus forward and you don't give up the old trends in music. Well, as time went on, I started learning about other trends in music. Well, we flash forward now about 7 years, and I had just graduated from high school. I was 17 years old, and I was working at my other job. The owner of my radio station was Lady Bird Johnson, who had then become First Lady of the United States, and Lyndon Johnson had earlier become President of the United States. So I went from in my first job as a radio disc jockey to being a White House advisor in my second job, but I kept the interest in music. Well, I met the Beatles, and this is this. I'll wrap up the memory lane stories with this one. I was asked to come to Houston. I didn't live in Houston at the time. I lived in Austin, and but I worked in Washington D.C. and I was working in the White House on working on an international trade piece of legislation that I was helping write. And so then I flew to Houston on a Friday night. I went downtown to the music hall, to the Coliseum, where the Beatles were doing two concerts. And I'm backstage talking to the Beatles. That's where I found out that how their style of music came into being. All they ever pretended to be, and they were, was they took older kinds of music and updated and upgraded and added new technology, and that's how they did it. They were dyed in the wool fans of 1950s music, so they took the music of Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly. They took their harmony style from a group called the Everly Brothers, as did Simon and Garfunkel. To model their style after the Everly Brothers from the 50s, but they sounded new and modern. So I'm backstage talking to the Beatles about all of that. And there's John Lennon sitting there with his glasses on reading a book. And I asked, and after we left, I said, "Do you have any closing thoughts?" before you go on stage? And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, all you need is love. And that was a
Woo!
song that they didn't record. They recorded it for an international broadcast 2 years later, but he was using that term in 1965. So then I introduced the Beatles. I'm one of the disc jockeys. I was there in my role as a disc jockey, not in my role as a White House advisor. So I introduced the Beatles. Well, come Monday, I'm back in the White House. And the president walks in and he looks around the office. He said, who else is here? Or we asked the first question. He says, how was the concert? He knew that where I had been and he wanted to show interest. He said, did they sing the songs that you wanted them to sing? And how did they do? Did you get a chance to talk to them about music? And I said, oh, yes. Oh, yes. And then he looks and he says, oh, well, what brought me into the office is he threw a file folder down on the desk and he says, well, you can handle this. I need to deliver a speech. I need for you to write the speech. I had never written a speech at that point in my life. And I thought to myself, oh, please, Lord, let the topic of this speech be about something that I'm working on, because my areas of expertise were civil rights, environmental, international trade, and the World's Fair. I was a policy guy, but I was a domestic. Well, I opened the file folder and the subject was about something that I knew nothing about, and that would be Vietnam. So the first speech that I ever wrote was not about music. It was not about civil rights. It was not about that stuff. It was about Vietnam. So I had 2 hours in which to write it, and I threw the term, all you need is love, into the speech. It was the first time anybody had ever heard that term on a national basis. And he attributed it to the Beatles. You know, he said building democracies around the world, part of it is all you need is love. You need to care about your customer base. Anyway, as time went on, I learned to ask the right questions of the music people, not necessarily about, you know, the usual topics. So when I was talking to Frank Sinatra, you know, in years later, it was not just about the music, but it was about the myth of Sinatra, you know, and I always learned really neat things from people, and some of it I put in the book. You know, I met one of my favorite songwriters, and she's still a major star, Carole King, the great Carole King.
Sure.
And I met her years ago, and I said, "How did you avoid writer's block? Can you give me an example?" These are the kind of questions I used to ask the music people, not the usual questions. So I said, how did you handle writer's block when you had a deadline? She worked in the Brill Building in New York City, and they didn't just write songs, they wrote hits. And she said, I said, well, do you write the song first and then do you write the title? She said, no, you write the title first, and it's a title that'll sell records. Then you write the song, which is what I learned when I was working in the White House. Do you write the speech about Vietnam first, or do you write the press release about what you said in the speech first? Well, the answer is you write the press release first, then you write the speech from the press release. So Carole King, I said, give me an example. And she said, well, one time we were facing writer's block. And she said, good question. No one's ever asked me these questions. And she said, well, it was Jerry Goffin, her husband at the time and songwriting partner. We went out for a smoke. You know, people smoked cigarettes in those days. And she goes, I said, well, where'd you go? She said, we took the elevator and walked around the top of the building. And we were talking, and one of us said to each other, looked around, smelled the smog, choked on the cigarette, and said, when this old world keeps getting me down, I go up where the air is fresh and clear. And the other one says, up on the roof. and that was became a number one song because they took
Wow.
a limitation and they turned it. And that's what the music industry is good about doing. And even moving up to contemporary artists, they take potential conflicts going on, and a
And
lot of
smush it.
music is written literally about what they were thinking and feeling at that moment. So it was a number one record. The Drifters recorded it. And then I said, well, what did your competition at the Brill Building do about that? I know how competitive you are, and I know how they like to one up you. How did it happen? She said, oh, thank you. No one's ever asked me that. She said, Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, who were the other songwriting team, they said, well, heck, if Carole King and Jerry Goffin can get a hit out of the top of our building, we'll get one out of the bottom. So I said, well, how did they get a hit out of the bottom of the building? She said they walked outside one day. It was a sunshiny day, and it was 1:30 in the afternoon. And one of them looked up at the glaring sign and said to the other one, they say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. They say there's magic in the air. That's how that song happened. It was
Oh
to,
my
to
gosh.
so they gave it to the Drifters, and the Drifters had another number
And
one.
they had another, they
And
had
George
another,
Benson later covered it. And on Broadway, a major song started out as a dare of two songwriting teams. That's how a lot of things happen in the business. A lot of music is exactly what you think it's about. And sometimes it's the opposite. It's got hidden meanings
sure.
sometimes. But that's what I learned is over the years, when you meet the people, you ask the questions that you don't think anyone's ever talked to them about before. Um, I said to Sinatra, tell me the songs that you hated and they made you record and they became big hits. And he started naming them off: My Way, New York, New York. These are songs he didn't want to record originally, but people said, try something different. It might work.
Wow. Hank, you have so much information. And Mac has a question.
Yeah.
Uh, I we
Yeah.
have, go ahead, please, Mac.
Frank, I'm sorry, Hank, all the changes you've seen over all these years, do you believe that the conflicts that exist today in the music industry is similar, worse, or better than what was happening back then? Because I'm 43 years old, so I don't really, 42, sorry. So I don't have much context to compare today's times with in the past. So
They're
could you
probably
just
better now, and there are a lot of reasons why. There's not as much music being put out now as there was back in the olden days. And that's a long story. I wrote a chapter about that in the book. There's probably 10% of the music that's out now. There used to be probably 10 times more music in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. That was the era in which more music was being put out, more music for conflict. There was a time in the 1950s. I mean, in my book, I've got 37 chapters, and I have chapters on each of the decades. And then the other chapters have to do with the types, the categories of music: Christmas music, classical music that was adapted to pop songs. Why was it adapted to pop songs? It's so they didn't have to pay royalties and get involved in lawsuits. So they would take known melodies and add new lyrics to them and come out with a hit record and not have to pay royalties. But anyway, to answer your question, there was a time in the 1950s when lawsuits and potential conflict was terrible. There were people in the music industry that would force groups, and I'm sorry to say, a lot of them were black R&B groups that were forced to turn over big percentages of their royalties
My God.
to. There was a disc jockey named Alan Freed, and he finally went to jail and he went down in conflict because he started groups like the Flamingos and the Moonglows to turn over half of their income to him to promote their records. That's what started the Paola scandal. And as a result of that, one of the members of the Flamingos saw the group being ripped off. His name was Joe Jackson. And in later years, after he and his wife had a big family, Michael and Latoya and Janet and all of them, that Jackson family, he remembered getting ripped off as a member of both the Flamingos and the Moonglows by unscrupulous people in the music industry. And he vowed that he was going to control the content of the songs, control the writing, control the production, and provide for his family. So he took the conflict of 1950s in which R&B groups were ripped off, and that gets into all kinds of other reasons
And
why.
Hank, and we're going to pick that up on the next interview
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
want to talk about some of these conflicts. And Natalia has some questions I can see as
good.
well. And we try to keep these about 25 minutes. So thank you so much for
Right.
this segment. And we'll have a second segment because you have more to talk about the conflict. And we'll be starting with the Jackson family. Everybody knows the Jackson family. So we look forward to it. Thank you so much, Hank, for sharing this information. You are absolutely the walking encyclopedia of pop culture. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, signing off.